welcome to another episode of Duck It. Today we have Butheina with us. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Chris, Nadia, nice to see you. It's been a few hours.
Yeah.
Hello,
Been
hello.
about 3 seconds. Really nice to see you. Thanks for coming on. Long time in the making. We just got back from an extended period of time in Canada, and we've kind of seen both sides of the oceans and how different societies are dealing with different things. My biggest question for you is, movie theaters were open there the whole time, and I couldn't get myself to, go see any movie. So I just wanted to ask you, how's it been for you guys generally?
You know what? It's been actually quite pleasantly surprising. It started off very, there was this moment of, of complete heartbreak when I walked into the theater after we'd set up all the social distancing measures. We'd been closed for, 3 months, and we went back into the theater, set things up. The team was working really hard on making sure that, every single thing was followed to a T. We followed there weren't really any standards or guidelines of, what exactly a space like ours would look like when you social distance, because we didn't really fit the conventional theater format. So, we had sort of a mishmash strategy of, theaters, performing arts, museums. We were piecing together insights from, theaters and everywhere from North America to Hong Kong to, guidelines here, and trying to figure out what would make a space like ours continue to feel like, what it's supposed to feel like, and still be able to do it safely as we were going into the summer months, knowing that we were going to be in an enclosed space, knowing that theaters were going to be this, high risk kind of danger zone, and there was all of that floating around, in my mind. And, we set things up hyper cautious, and I walked into the space, and I sit down on, the sort of the allocated seat, and I just look around, and somehow there was a sort of wash of emotion, of knowing that, you had just been sort of battered and, been through a car crash or some sort of storm, and you're looking around you. But a week into, settling into it, and I guess that's true to all walks of life and different industries, some level of normalcy and, the confidence and the sort of the bet that people were, taking on both trusting us as a space and doing the right thing. And, their curiosity and love, for cinema and for the program just really, took over. It was this sort of this almost balm, that washed over the space and made it feel like, it's always been this way. It's a little quieter, it's a bit more spacious, but somehow it still felt true to the brand, as a Cinema Akil. So now I feel much better. I feel, grateful, relatively, speaking, looking at all the theaters, multiplexes and art houses all over the world. I mean, every couple of days I was getting emails from, fellow cinemas in, particularly in North America, and the United States, that were shutting doors, not really sure when they're going to open, holding out for a vaccine, until they're able to reopen to their communities. So in a way, we were lucky that, we were able to keep our team intact, that, we kept, being able to show films, that we were able to reopen safely, that our audiences also, were very willing to, to do what was necessary to keep the place going. And here we are. We're still planning for next year, and we've been open, and we've had, an even more successful summer than we had last year, because we also had the luxury of, despite the limitation in seating, we had people, not traveling, and we didn't have the grand exodus of Dubai summer months. So somehow people were, were parched for, coming together, for cinema, for, being here. And we put together a program themed around travel. So travel through the screen, and concepts around, and films that sort of dealt with the idea of escapism, but also, finding yourself through wanderlust and getting lost, and the dark side of travel as well. And people were yearning for that. And that sort of, that bet that we took, or that sort of, that romanticism that we had around being able to live vicariously through the characters in a film really came through. And so it feels good. It feels good to be here and having this conversation.
It's so interesting to hear you speak. It kind of sounds like you have a very clear, idea of what the role of Cinema Akil is in our community, especially in these circumstances. How would you characterize that? Like, what's the role of an independent kind of cinema, especially in these circumstances, in your mind? How do you think about that?
Look, it's a role that changed over time. It's a role that also was informed by the way that audiences and people and our community started to engage with the cinema. So we started off with a particular idea of, what an art house cinema, is supposed to do editorially, what kind of films we want to bring, what kind of narratives we want to shape, what kind of, cinematic sort of languages we want to introduce or tropes we want to challenge. And it evolved into a much more tactile, and communal and spatial philosophy, as much as it was about an editorial philosophy and the kind of films that we were presenting on screen. So it went part and parcel, with sort of as people were coming through our doors, and as we had more conversations, and as we partnered with more partners, that idea began to solidify. And I think ultimately it rallied around this idea of, of collective consciousness and collective care. And and the way the details in which that comes through. So whether it's collective care through a common cause and showing films around a particular issue, or around topics of social justice, for example, that different people can congregate around, or it's the actual kind of spatial experience of bringing people, the political spatial experience of bringing bodies together to share an idea, to share a moment, to be shaped collectively in different ways. And I think that's what ultimately, I value the most. And that's why I still, despite, the challenges that are going to continue to face the industry of theatrical exhibition that was already happening, before the pandemic. I mean, it's not a new conversation. We were talking about, VOD, we were talking about small screen, we were talking about that switch a while before, much longer before the pandemic hit. But I think the sort of the importance, or the the sort of the clarity of mission, or the clarity of meaning, really came through during that time. And ultimately, we were all looking at many screens, we were all watching films, we were all streaming. Everybody knows the stock prices of Netflix and Amazon and all the streaming platforms and what happened with that. But ultimately, people yearned to come back together. People, still wanted to have this shared experience, and hence the social kind of component of, all the programming that, that we started to see, en masse, flood our screens, and all the webinars and all the social occasions that we wanted to kind of, to put together, a scramble to put together when we were, separated. So in a way, that for me is what, what a space like, an art house cinema should do. Is really bring people together and hold safe space.
Do you think that your programming approach will change, or given all the experiences that you've lived through and all of the issues that we're seeing in the social justice space? Do you see, because it sounds like you already had that intention there, do you see any kind of elaboration of that as time goes on in the programming?
No, I think it's actually it's clearer. Yeah. I think it's actually more, I think, unapologetic in a way, because there's no more, sort of pressure of like, we are squeezed, right now. We are in the moment of truth. We are in that transition where, studios are making, transformative deals, with VOD platforms and streaming platforms that are changing the face of, the holding window for theaters that made it possible for them to continue to operate and made the theatrical window still hold. So their industry is transforming, the world is transforming, and all these things together kind of, force us to really think about what is it that we're here to do, and ultimately, what kind of films are we here to program? What kind of conversations do we want to host? And that's always been kind of at the back of our mind. But, when you're at sort of peak, you get distracted, and and you go in a lot of different directions, and some of them are commercially necessary decisions that you have to make. You prioritize we're a single screen cinema, so sometimes we prioritize certain films over others because it made more, more monetary sense. And obviously that's always going to have to continue to build a sustainable model to, to keep the conversation going. But that insistence on, what it is that we're doing differently than your multiplexes, what we're doing differently than the mainstream cinema conversation, or exclusively, sort of a commercial conversation. And also, what are we doing different than VOD, productions that are made to go straight to VOD, the Netflix originals and the Amazon originals and so on. What is it that we're doing at the space that, that will be different and that is sort of representative of the core values of what we do? So the sort of the alignment, I guess, on, on what we stand for, or the sort of the programming pillars really kind of, shine through and are informing the way that we're thinking about, the future. The other thing that did happen also is, is during the lockdown, or sort of emerging out of the lockdown, not only are we coming into sort of a dead time for, releases and, and programming pushbacks. I mean, all festivals were canceled beyond, after Berlin, like all major festivals either went digital or, were held back, release dates were pushed back, cinemas were, were opening and closing in some parts of the world. So there was a lot of uncertainty around, what is it that we're going to, that we're going to bring, and our plans also for film weeks, for example, we didn't, we weren't following necessarily a release slate, right? Like we weren't showing, the latest film that hit as soon as it came out of Cannes, but we did, bet on recency, of certain titles, particularly films that came out of the region, and also, specific film weeks that we were betting on to also create, a sort of a hallmark new, either festival or asset, for the cinema. For example, we had the Sudan Film Week, which was, incredibly important for us, coming out of, almost a year from the Sudanese revolution. It was the year, like 2019 was the sort of the year of the Sudanese film. There were so many good productions that we were, hoping to, to bring to audiences in the UAE for the first time, filmmakers that we were hoping to host, and all of that was in the works right before lockdown hit. So, that got pushed back, practically speaking, because we didn't want to sort of, burn the opportunity or the, the chance to really get as big an audience as we could. The other thing that we did was also kind of backtrack on a resistance to escapism, because we'd always kind of thought of the films that we show as an invitation to be in the hyper-conscious or the hyper-present moment, right? And to really be contemplative, in your engagement with the films that we show. And what we had to kind of do as a, almost not even as a commercial resort, but also as a, I guess, an act of, attempted empathy, is to meet people where they were, and to meet ourselves where we were also, because, people were stuck and they were, they were exhausted, and they were, it's an unprecedented sort of, social condition. So, creating a program that tried to, help ease the way into the world and remind people of what is beautiful, and remind people of, like, coming out of your, your tunnel, or hovel, in some ways, can be beautiful, can be majestic, can be, a dreamscape of sorts, and really kind of bet on that language, in this travel program as we went through it. And, and we were pleasantly surprised to see the reception of that and the impact of it. Every time I walked into the cinema as the film was playing, it was almost like a, like a sort of a meditative sort of therapeutic act, seeing Agnès Varda, on the beaches of the south of France, and, Federico Fellini's, like, La Dolce Vita, and like the superfluous kind of dreamscape of those films. There is something very romantic that, we all kind of need to tap into at times, especially when things are so daunting and uncertain.
Does that makes it quite difficult then to transition into those harder factual documentaries, given the fact that people are still, I guess, grieving the situation? So I guess, how do you tell the pulse of the audience of when that transition might happen?
I mean, for us, it's trying to, as much as we can with the resources that we have, to the best of our ability, keep our eyes and ears open and keep our hearts open in a way, and and really be present and try to see sort of the reception around, like, trying certain things, like I don't know, like a film like what we have at the end of this program, which is a film by Ulrich Ortinger, which is a sort of an experimental feminist, never before seen in the entire region, film from Berlin, called The Ticket of No Return, is sort of a transition into the more, sort of experimental and less sort of, I guess, switching off vacation mode, if you like, and delving into sort of reality. We're gonna try different things, and we're gonna try. I mean, I don't think, like, for example, like the last film that we had slated before the lockdown was For Sama, which is the Oscar award-winning film, and it's an incredibly heavy film. It's an incredibly it's set in Syria, and it's documents. It's documentary. It's a personal story. It's devastating to watch and to feel. And we had the option of bringing it back, but it just didn't feel like the right time. It just didn't feel like this made sense. And we did. I mean, we did. Technically speaking, we ran our surveys and we spoke to people and we kind of consulted. And it just didn't seem that was the moment. And I think we've done our part now in sort of in walking the the trail. And I think it's time we circle back and see how that works, gently but surely.
I'm actually sorry to do this, but I'm actually like noticing really the size of that duck behind you. I never really took the time to pay attention. You mentioned it earlier before we started recording, but then I just noticed it. So I just have to mention that
guest.
I see him.
Her.
And, or her, and he's a welcome guest, especially for Beckett. So thank you for bringing along a friend.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I needed that kind of relatability, that moral support. Like if I could relate to a duck in the world, it would be this one, which is caused. Yeah, I mean,
Why?
I don't know what she is or he is. I'm not really sure, and we haven't. I didn't feel the need to get into that with him. So
she's got really big feet, though. She's cool.
Yeah. No, but like in all seriousness, this has actually like been a sort of a fixture of a lot of like conversation. There's been a lot of like, I think, like angst that it's caused, being in my domestic space, and I absolutely love it for that. It's by this artist. It's a work that I fell in love with when I saw it at. There's this artist I really like and have a personal kind of affinity to. That's based now in Abu Dhabi. She's an artist called Maytha Abdullah, and grew up in her grandmother's house in Khorfakan, which is a small sort of village, I guess, in Sharjah. And her entire body of work kind of skirts the sort of the space of the theatrical, the gloom, the uncertainty. And this piece was part of a sort of a sculpture play and painting series that she did around her uncle's dreams. Her uncle suffered from schizophrenia, and he would tell her stories in her grandmother's house about about his dreams and about all these characters and about the chickens and the roosters and the ducks and the pigs and all these characters that he would bring in. So she created this entire body of work from the sort of the windmills of his mind, and somehow, like, I just out of all the pieces, I just like connected to this duck when I saw it in her studio in Bay 15 in Abu Dhabi, and like it just never left my mind. And
I understand
a year
the feeling.
later,
We connected ducks too.
Connecting to ducks.
Cool.
It sounds
thanks.
like a book.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, you're such a great storyteller and you curate storytelling. And I know that you've directed a documentary. Does that ever interest you, that side of what you do?
So much.
Of the
So
time.
much. but I just don't know when the moment will be again. You know, like I don't think of like the work that I did, you know, back in 2010 was sort of a result, like an impulsive result of urgency, you know, to tell this kind of story. It was made on an absolute shoestring budget. You know, it was a labor of love of, you know, of friends and people who donated their time, which seems to be kind of the trend in my life is like, you know, how do I get people to do things that we all care about, but for like no money. And, you know, and believe that like it should make a difference in the world. And, you know, and Letters to Palestine at the time was that, like, I was interested in this idea of, you know, how do we, it all came from this one conversation, you know, of you know, people, it was a friend of mine who was organizing something called Ziara, which is a series of trips to Palestine by people who could travel there. And you know, she kept telling me about these stories of, you know, of people who, you know, either became, you know, naturalized, you know, in Canada or in the US, and suddenly were able to, you know, and they were Arabs or, you know, Palestinians, and they were able to, you know, suddenly go back to the homeland and be able to connect. And the reactions of people there when, you know, they were able to meet people who came, you know, who had never been there. And she was telling me how, you know, they felt forgotten and they felt disconnected, and despite, you know, all these different ways that we think we're connected, you know, there's a sort of divide, and they believe that they're forgotten, you know, in a way by the Arab, you know, sentiment, or even, you know, forget the political landscape just from a sort of, you know, top of heart, you know, standpoint. And that's where it came from. So I'm like, oh my God, like this is something, you know, I really think we need to figure out a way of you know, of getting that idea across, that, you know, despite what's happening geopolitically, there is still a very live, you know, sort of sentiment and feeling and connection of what Palestine even represents in the symbolic sort of, you know, standpoint to the hearts and minds of people of different generations. So we just went out and, like, you know, with a camera and a very basic lighting kit, and interviewed, you know, anybody that we could speak to that was doing work with you know, with the idea. Some people were very involved. So, you know, we had like somebody like Nadia Rouchdy, who was, you know, one of the founders of the Free Gaza movement, the Freedom Flotilla. And then we had people who were just, you know, theater actors, you know, who were interested in, like, in interpreting Palestinian, you know, work. And there were collectors that were, you know, that were trying to build a Palestinian contemporary art collection, and so on. So anyway, like, long story short, like, it was always sort of this accidental yearning that drove me to make something or to create something. And with Cinema Akil, it's frustrating because on one hand, like, there are stories that I feel like need to be told, and I always feel that, and I always, you know, have my sort of, you know, my folder of, you know, of ideas and stories and films that if I were to ever make, and all the, you know, stories that I feel, you know, should be told, whether in a producing capacity or whether in a directorial capacity, you know, I'm not really sure yet. But there's also this urgency of, you know, there's just so much that's being made and so much that's being, you know, shown elsewhere, that, you know, there's this kind of, I guess, you know, responsibility that I have, you know, with a space like, you know, like Cinema Akil, to make sure that these are also accessible before I, you know, I take on a 2 to 3 year, you know, production project, and really, like, kind of immerse myself in it and indulge myself effectively, because that's what you have to do if you're to surrender to the sort of the poetic aspect of figuring out what that story will be, you know. So yes, it exists. One day, somehow, I'm not sure yet.
It's funny because, like, I'm super naive, I guess, to the topic or to the area. But why is it that I feel that there is not an abundance being produced and created, not an abundance of expression coming out? Why do I feel like the opposite these days? Is that not true?
Because nobody shows it. Because, you know, like, these films, I mean, you know, in the entire Gulf region, it's, you know, it's a very sad fact that we're the only ones that are, like, you know, focused on art house, you know, programming. I mean, there are attempts and there are people that put on independent screening, not to say that we're the only ones that are, like, interested in this, but in an actual kind of, you know, theatrical capacity with a box office and so on, you know, we're, like, we're trying to show as much as possible of, of regional content and larger regional content. And, we still don't have enough real estate, to release those films. And, the entire Arab world, I mean, if you think about it, the MENA region has 13 screens and not all of them are active cinemas, so there is a dearth of actual exhibition of platforms, of whether it's theaters, whether it's streaming platforms where they become visible. I mean, you did see the sort of big announcements, during lockdown of all the 45, big Arab titles that were made available to Netflix. And, that's great, but ultimately it's also governed by the algorithms, and it's governed by, essentially like, production budgets that need to privilege certain productions over others and need to get eyeballs to certain, series over others and so on. So there is a lack of representation. There are no festivals anymore in the UAE. There are no more major festivals. There was the Red Sea Festival that everybody was banking on, also got hit by the lockdown. So, that entire sort of, landscape of creating, it's not just about, having a festival. It's not just about the sort of the red carpet and the glamour of the festival status, but it's about, giving those films their rightful place in the global narrative.
Share of voice, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, and equal playing field, and not to only kind of relegate them to the world cinema category, or the specialist, sort of, the Middle East Film Festival of, I don't know, Florence. It's really kind of putting them, on the same playing field, on the same, voice and importance as the rest of the world, and also creating connections between films coming out of this region and also other larger regions, or the global south. Effectively, that's the sort of the world that we tend to underrepresent in these commercial sort of spaces. So I don't feel like there's a lack of content.
Is that for lack of demand or interest, or has that changed over time? I mean,
I think it's a bit of both. Yeah. I mean, I really don't think it's a lack of demand. I just think there has been a conditioning, technical conditioning, by sort of actual programming opportunities, production, grants and funding made available, algorithmic bias, all these different ways that content gets privileged over other. And also, I think there is a cultural shift that also needs to come, part and parcel. When you've all you've had, for the past, 4 decades of theatrical exhibition in a country like the UAE is, your blockbusters, your Hollywood, your Bollywood, your Malayalam, big ticket films, your commercial Egyptian titles. There is a sort of a backtracking and a parallel exercise that needs to happen, to create, I guess, curiosity or importance as well. And that's a whole ecosystem. It's everything from, actually having the theatrical spaces. It's from, criticism, in the press, and engagement. It's from coverage. It's from, funding and marketing budgets. It's from education and film literacy. It's from, I think, deeper notions of colonial conditioning of what is considered, important in the world of cinema and film. I mean, that's another level of it, right? We do a single release of a Federico Fellini and we sell out within the first, couple of weeks. And, we do the same for, I don't know, Youssef Chahine, even with, as big a name as he is, you still don't have the same level of reception, or importance. And I think that takes time. And I think that's fine, but it just needs to be a sustainable exercise. And that's why I think for me, the film festival departure or cancellation was such a big blow. It's not just because, we had a film festival and it was really cool and we, and we had all these films coming to Dubai. It was more about the absence, the multiplicity of absences that, were complementary to the work that we do, whether it's, on the press level, on the exposure level, on the Oscar qualifying level, on the funding level, of pre-production and post-production grants. And that whole thing just left a big gaping hole in the ecosystem.
Is there a country right now in the region that is investing in that whole ecosystem to advance it, to a stage of another country? I don't know. I don't want to say Eurocentric country, but any other comparable country that invests in film?
I mean, look, I think what's happening in Tunisia is really interesting. Like Tunisia is probably the most engaged, cinema audience in the Middle East and North African region. They have like incredible, box office numbers on, specifically like Tunisian content and, and like even regional content. I mean, films like, we did a film called, I'm blanking right now. This happens a lot, when you've like, I was looking at the Excel sheet of all the films. Yeah. But, there are some films, like, for example, a film like Under the Shadow, by, oh God, Amir. We had the film here and we had the filmmaker here and, anyway, we have, what I'm trying to say is whether it's a film that is seemingly obscure, an Iranian film, for example, coming into a territory, like North Africa, specifically to a Tunisian audience, primarily Tunisian audience, and outperforms, a blockbuster title, outperforms a Hollywood title. You have lineups, going to the end of the, of the alley, for a short, Tunisian horror film, the level of like engagement and interest. And there's, on the other side, on the sort of infrastructure, so that's from the audience kind of awareness standpoint. From an infrastructure sort of standpoint, you also have a lot of investment from, the Tunisian cinema centers. You have the Ministry of Culture investing in supporting, filmmakers and production companies and really getting behind building that, that ecosystem. You also have a very strong, one of the strongest, I think, cinema club federation of cinema clubs. Like they have, I think, about 72 members across the country that are incredibly active in organizing independent screenings and discussions and and really speaking to their hyper local audiences. So that's a model that that's really interesting and is doing great work and is producing content that is also rivaling a lot of international sort of titles that we hear about in major festivals. So there is that sort of that's the Tunisian model. I think different markets are also engaging with content support and production in a different way. So, what's happening in Saudi is interesting now because, I mean, some of that effort was halted because of the absence of the film festival, which was supposed to be sort of a milestone moment to really understand what, that the fruits of that support, because, you had like the writers' workshops or the screenwriting workshops that were happening before the festival, and you had, grants that were announced and, films that were actually made, like Haifa Mansour's The Perfect Candidate, for example, was the first recipient of, of that, of the co-production fund. And, the festival was sort of supposed to be this sort of, milestone or this turning point to really understand what the Saudi landscape was going to, to be. And yet, a lot of the films that also did get, financial support, are performing really well, are coming out. Like you have a film called Shams al-Ma'arif that just hit theaters here in the UAE. It released in Saudi during Eid break, during the heart of the pandemic, and Saudi is it's quite hard hit by the pandemic, but they reopened with social distancing measures, and the film did really, really well. They had, I think they hit their 100,000 mark, which during a pandemic, and summer, and the absence of a theatrical release slate is quite remarkable. So it's interesting. I mean, Saudi is like one to watch. The UAE hasn't quite like backtracked from investing in theater, but I mean in theatrical production, in theatrical releases and productions made for theatrical releases. But I think there's also this bet on is this really where we need to be investing? Should we just fast forward to the future and jump the gun and straight to VOD programming? And I think it's had a lot of ups and downs in its sort of in its production strategy, but and there is still there are still sort of tax incentives and co-production incentives and rebates and those programs that are here to help facilitate more production to happen in the UAE as a location, but not necessarily the same level of investment in indigenous, production. And I think that discrepancy is what we're kind of feeling among specifically like the filmmaking circle here. Like there's this frustration that there is a discrepancy of support.
Is there a place or a time where VOD is something you guys are going to look at?
Yeah, possibly, but I mean, we did look into it, and I think like horses for courses. What we were sent to this land to do is to bring people together around the artful medium of film and theatrical exhibition. So for the time being, I think our work here is not done, and for me, it's not really about just making the films available. It's really about the sort of the ancillary and the support system and the community engagement part that's really important. I also think there's other kind of technical challenges, and and the startup ecosystem will attest to that. All attempts for VOD, it's a whole other ballgame. I mean, for VOD, production and creating a similar model to the Netflix, for the region. I mean, you have Shahid and Shahid VIP now that's doing some of its own, they're doing their own productions, they're co-producing with Amazon, they're putting out their own content, but I think, there's still a struggle for eyeballs. There's still a lag in the uptake of VOD exclusively, and there's still a need to kind of I guess give the films that we're interested in the time of the day, or the sort of the
attention,
the rightful TLC that it needs to get before saying, okay, here's more of that. Here's how you can now that you've discovered the world of Arthouse and what that means, and and films by Jibril Mambeti Diop, and what it means to be interested in in Chilean cinema, and you want to see more of that, then there's a sort of a complementary VOD world that can supplement that. And we ran our own kind of experiment or partnership with Movie in the early days of the lockdown, and we offered, and they do incredible programming that complements the kind of programming that we do. Obviously, it's a whole, I think, and that's the thing that the sort of the VOD conversation is right now, is how do you get to how do you curate, how do you filter, how do you Netflix is floating the shuffle button idea, and there's all these different attempts of helping people navigate the plethora or the sort of the abundance, and I think same goes for Arthouse. It's also a little bit more challenging because it requires a lot of prefacing, it requires a lot of sort of landscaping before you jump into a particular directorial work, or the cinema of a particular region, or thematic, or style. So I think it takes a little bit more time. It will prove to be a little bit more challenging, and I think there have been attempts in the region, like Mina.org, for example, that was supposed to be a documentary VOD platform. There was Movie Pigs, another VOD attempt. They've had a hard time, breaking into the market. So, doing the kind of film that we want to do, we'll have to find that sweet spot when we're ready to make the shift. But for now, I think we're sticking to our guns.
On the film festivals, I mean, you're talking about the absence that VOD has in congregating and kind of elevating the consciousness. Film festivals have gone online, and that must have left an incredible loss. Last year, you traveled the entire year, didn't you, to go to film festivals? How have you overcome that loss?
I haven't. I mean, every like month or so, I'd like scroll back into like the images of all the festivals that I attended, and like all the different, because I attended them in different capacities, and there is this like undeniable. I mean, I was lucky because I got to go to Berlin before the lockdown, and that was like my last sort of travel experience, and I mean it was literally being stuck in a in Friedrichstadtpalast, which is like this gigantic, theatrical space with 2,000 some spectators, in the middle of winter, right before, like a week before the pandemic hit, with people like coughing throughout the the, the screening, and not really, and being, I think, blissfully, sort of oblivious to what's to come. And I got that, final kind of reminder of, of the magic of experiencing film in that way, and and ultimately, like, kind of carry that through the period of lockdown. Obviously, there are different coping mechanisms and ways that we tried to develop to kind of keep that link. And what was really important for us is to not lose that communal sort of, I guess, focus in some ways. So we launched, a series of, like, we launched our virtual Cinema Club, which was, with the movie partnership, and then we moved on to other sort of, content platforms or opportunities of different types of films that you usually wouldn't be able to, show at the cinema because of either, the topic, or, the sort of the non-commercial viability of the film, or, or just, maybe even the length or the duration or different technical limitations. So we zeroed in on that content. And ultimately what the virtual Cinema Club was, it's totally non-monetizable. But what it did was, it reminded us, first of all, as a team, of why it is that we do what we do, and that there are people that care about this, and the types of conversations. There was a surprising sort of intimacy that came out of these conversations, and some of them would just be, 5 to 7 people, and some of them were, overwhelmingly, like, interesting, or or popular, and we'd have like 40 people join the call to talk about a given film. And and I think that was really important. That was a really important kind of survival strategy. I attended my whole kind of share of online festivals, and the workshops, and the meetings, and that whole gamut. And as much as I tried to get into it, as much as I like to say that it achieved a technical goal, and I'm glad that that festivals were able to pivot, especially those that had very strong market components, because it meant that the lifeline of certain projects continued and was able to sustain, and they were having the meetings they needed to have, and they were doing the networking they were needing to do. But yeah, it doesn't take the place of that shared experience, and that the release, the magic of the premiere, and being in the same room with a filmmaker, especially like first time filmmakers, and and witnessing that moment of the reception, and even the ugly side of it, was something that I missed, sitting in line for 2 hours before a Cannes screening at like 6:30 in the morning, and trying to, like, elbow your way to the front of the line as it got messy. Like, there's a lot of these like ugly parts of of the film festivals that are like less glamorous, and part of the magic of it. And that's that's what gets captured in the variety stories that you read, and in the the reviews of the films. And it's about the mood of the filmmaker before they got up on stage, or the critic before they how many cocktails they had before they caught the premiere of a certain film, before reviewing it, and what that does for the career of a filmmaker, just like those very critical kind of high intensity adrenaline rush moments, or whatever conversation you could be having, at random, in a reception, of a given production company, like that change your life, and I think those are the things that you just can't replace.
We've been talking for about 45 minutes. I have a question, and I'm sure maybe Nadia have another one. But if you had a room full of people who've never been to Cinema Akil or any other art house kind of cinema, what would you say to them, especially today, and how would that have changed versus before the pandemic?
Welcome back to the same old place that you laughed about.
What makes you think that they laugh at it?
I mean, there's a sort of a grimy kind of love that every art house, kind of shares, and this is something I realized, like I did or had the privilege of doing the keynote speech for the Arthouse Convergence in Utah last January, which brings together about 700 some, art house operators or owners from around, mostly all over the United States, but also parts of Europe and other places. And, there's a sort of common denominator of like, a shared bet on the underdog. There's the sort of survival, joint kind of mission that's almost universal, that bets on this sort of shared language of, light and shadow against all odds, and no matter how shitty your seats are, and no matter how stale the popcorn is, and no matter how many times your projector goes off, there's the sort of, bet on the, on the importance of what we do.
You're really selling it.
But that's the secret sauce. That's the secret sauce that keeps people coming back, so there's this like love, hate, romanticism. It's like, your grandmother's living room, like there's a sort of feeling of like belonging to something that's, that's almost,
bigger than you,
primordial. Yeah.
So that's the message then. Be part of something.
Yeah. And we got you.
Okay.
We got your back.
All right. Well,
I have a last question.
Oh, okay. Go for it.
How many films have you watched?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. At some point, I nerded out and started sort of this tally. I created like my own like IMDb and tried to kind of keep track. And I have like lists floating around left, right, and center of, all of the films. And I still feel the sort of the imposter syndrome of not having had the sort of the lifespan to watch all the films that I need to watch, and like to qualify, as somebody that does the work that I do. And there's just so much out there, and there's so much to catch up on, and there's so much that, that fascinates me. But one thing I'll tell you is that no matter how many films I watch, it never loses the magic. Like, all you need to do is like put me in front of a film that I, connect to, and I just remember exactly, it brings me back to like day one, of figuring out how we're gonna make this thing happen. And I'm grateful, for it. I'm grateful for the opportunities that put me, like, especially when you become so caught up in running a business of this sort that's so precarious, and the operational side of it, and the logistics, and the manpower, and the bottom line, and all of those things. There is this sort of very like crass pragmatism that goes into, that intervenes with your like with your poetry, So it's the films themselves and the filmmakers themselves that always kind of like save me and rescue me from, from the darkness. And they really did during this like lockdown, and it was a great time to kind of really like hone in on that world, and bring me back to the films. And now I'm doing this work as one of the members of the International Documentary Award, and we're watching films that are just like really steeped in the art of everything that we're striving to do here. So that has been a really like, I think, saving grace, for this period.
That's amazing.
Thanks a lot, Butheina. We really appreciate the time. Hopefully we'll have you back later on in a couple of seasons to catch up and see how the progress has, come along with the theater. We appreciate the time, as I said. Thank you very much. And yeah, that's another episode of Decade with Butheina from Cinema Akil. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Chris, Nadia, and Siri. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.